Dave Nikolejsin is going to provide us with a bit of a reality check or reflections on the moment in time, however you want to think about it. And then we're going to talk about the project that we've been working on for a while, and a number of the people in the room are on the steering committee, and that is what we call the Decarbonization in Asia project. But it's really about the question that a lot of us think about. We know that, it was said earlier, if we achieve net zero in Canada, that's great. Unfortunately, it doesn't change the trajectory of climate change globally. And we believe, we hope, we want to believe that our low carbon resources make a significant contribution to decarbonization efforts in other parts of the world, particularly those that, like in Asia, make a much more significant contribution to GHG emissions. And this project that RJ is going to talk about after Dave is all about how do we know that's true? How would we document it? How would we make it become true if it's not already true? And we're going to learn about that as our grand finale for the day. But first of all, Dave, over to you. Thanks very much for being flexible and adaptive. Yep. And looking forward to your remarks.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone who's still stuck it out this long. I appreciate it. I'm going to just talk about, if you can bring my slides up, some context. And we've talked about a bunch of this stuff before, but I'm going to try to put it in a bit of perspective, and hopefully for FNCI and for others in the room to kind of consider as we think about this. And context, one example is as a person who in my previous career for many, many years was responsible as a deputy minister responsible for BC Hydro, chair of the board of the Oil and Gas Commission, probably wrote more orders to the Utilities Commission than any other person in the history, given who my ministers were and how activist they were in putting the thumb on the scale of the regulatory environment for energy in BC. It's always interesting to attend conferences like this and just hear the conversation about what's possible, how it works, and what happens, and why decisions happen, and why things are the way they are. So there's some context, because I'll tell you, I understand better than a lot of people why things are the way they are. So just get on with it here. So we talked about this, Linda actually brought it up earlier, and the reason this context things are so important, and what I'm going to talk about in the backdrop here, is imagine the world and what we'd be able to do today if some of these things didn't happen, or if they'd happened differently. I mean, why are we so broke? Why is the BC government doing what it's doing from a policy perspective right now? Why is David Eby and a lot of folks who were pretty anti-fossil fuels and LNG in previous lives now all of a sudden in favor of it, right? We're broke. And context matters. Global pandemic, really, really changed the level of trust that people have in their governments and the institutions we have. And, think about what the world would look like had COVID-19 never happened. Same for Russia. And we talked about Germany, and we talked about, what's going on out there with, why are we all interested in energy the way we are? And had Europe, had Russia never invaded Ukraine and Nord Stream 2 actually, instead of getting blown up, was in service, what would the world look like? What would be going on out there right now? And especially, would LNG Canada ever have been, in service? Would the U.S. be the number one exporter of LNG right now? And then, of course, tariffs and what the world looks like, and Team Canada, Bill C-5, Major Projects Office. Would any of that have happened? How serious would we be as a country having these conversations we're having about all these things had that not happened and created, the Carney effect and what we're seeing all around that? So FNCI is asking itself these questions, right? Should we do these things? Should we be in favor of them? Are they good? Are they bad? We just had a great conversation about nukes. I'm not going to try to answer any of these. All I'm going to say is what you think about what you should think about these things and how you should think about them, and should you support them, and are you in favor of them, and are you willing to stick your neck out politically, depends on the context that you're asking yourself those questions within. So let's look at a couple things. I'm really happy to see the IEA has put back in what they call their current policies scenario. So for the past 5 years, the International Energy Association has taken out what was called the current policies scenario, I think because of political pressure in the US from the Biden administration not to show what's really happening out there in the world, because it kind of wrecked the narrative about why we should all be investing in renewables and more climate activism, because it's kind of discouraging to see what's really happening. And we had talked earlier, there's some great presentations about COP earlier, and it is true that multiple things can be true at the same time. So the good news, the good hard work of spending upwards of $1 trillion globally on renewables over the past pick a time period, is it has bent over the curve. That's the good news. The current policy scenario, what that says is, if you look at all the current policies of the governments, worldwide, that in the climate space of what's really going on, this is the likely forward projection of where climate is and where their emissions are going. So the gray line, which you can't really see, is up till today, and it's been going up, 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 up. Current policies say it's bending over and flattening. But this idea that we're on the green line it's not true, right? And so the stated policies scenario, you can ask questions at the end if you want. The stated policies scenario is if everything started happening that governments are currently saying they're going to do in the future, you could get onto that blue line in the middle. Things like, EV policies, which, by the way, are changing rapidly to become less stringent. They are. If you're paying attention today, the U.S. government just today removed energy efficiency standards for vehicles in the U.S. So this idea that car manufacturers have to maintain a curve of reduction or increases in fuel efficiency standards, that went away today. Guess what? That's in the stated policies scenario, no longer true. And I could go on. So this is what's going on out there, and it's neither bad nor good. It's just what is happening. And those of us who do care about climate, which includes me, looks at this and says, we need to actually make a bigger difference than these curves are currently showing. And I'll get into that. Got the wrong thing here. This thing. So where are these emissions coming from? So if you look at what's actually going on out there, again, multiple things can be true at the same time. So developed countries, the OECD countries essentially, have done a pretty good job in bending that curve over. That's the blue line at the top. But it's when we look at that last chart, where the emissions actually starting to come from more and more are both China and the developing world. So you'll go to a lot of places, and if you focus on the renewables story in China, it's astoundingly good. China's carpeting mountains with solar panels. They're putting up wind everywhere. There's a lot of very, very impressive renewable, in fact, leading the world by a mile in renewables. But what China's also figured out is you got to firm it up. So this idea that the world's going to be all renewables, it's just wrong. You cannot integrate all of those renewables into your grid without planfully figuring out how you're going to firm it up. In BC, we're very lucky we have hydro. In China, what they're building is an awful lot of coal to firm it up. And so you'll see right about now, those curves are actually crossing over. So yes, two things can be true at the same time. China's leading the world in renewables. China's also leading the world in emissions. So inside China, where's that coming from? So this chart shows you how many new coal plants are coming online by year in China. And, I totaled it up on the right-hand side. So if you add those bars together, over the last 10 years, there's about 550 gigawatts of new coal plants being built. That's why that chart I just showed you is going up and up and up and up, because these plants are coming online. And they're coming online because China needs firm baseload generation. They're also getting it from places like gas. So LNG to China is a big story. Gas-fired power plants in China are about a tenth of this story. Most of the baseload generation coming on is coal. There is a lot of LNG going into China. So if you take that, divide it by 10, you'll kind of see they're building about 10% of this much in gas-powered generation as well. But the gas in China tends to be more about peak load shaving than baseload power, because you can ramp gas much easier. And then, again, context is everything. So Site C is about a gigawatt, just for context. Three Gorges Dam, another thing China did, built the world's largest hydro facility called Three Gorges Dam. And again, for baseload firm power, dispatchable power, it's about 22 gigawatts. Again, just for context, last year, that red bar, 100 gigawatts of coal in 1 year. There's pictures, like these look like AI pictures. They're not. These are real pictures of just one piece of infrastructure China has brought into service in the last couple of years. So this is the Haiji Railway. Those are pictures of that railway system. It was built to move coal inside China. So that's what, so anybody who thinks they're about to abandon coal, this is infrastructure they're bringing online right now. In the global picture, okay, so that was China. The good news is, in the global picture, you can see in that, the bottom line there, if you look at the coal picture, the gray line ends where we are today. So you can see coal was going up, COVID-19 happened, staggered down a bit, and then as soon as COVID was over, started climbing again. We're just at the point in time where the IEA believes coal has finally stopped growing. So even in the current policy scenario, which is the top red line, those current policy scenario, the IEA believes the world is going to start using a lot less coal. And, depending upon whether you believe the stated policy scenario, it could go all the way down to, 3.5. That's still 3.5 billion tons of coal per year by 2050. And that's if we hit it out of the park, you're still going to be that much. Oil is in the middle there, and what the current policy scenario says is, you can see the gray line where during COVID use of oil ratcheted down. The red line is oil use is still going up, and in the current policy scenario is up to $113 million, 113 million barrels a day of oil. And then natural gas, again, hardly showed an impact during COVID, and again is expected to grow from up to 5.5 trillion cubic meters of gas per year. And, if you go into the IEA report, it'll show you where all those uses are going, but that's what's going on. Hopefully last thing I'll talk about coal here is if you go back a slide, you see right where this chart's tipping over up here. It's kind of that shows that today the coal tipping over. If you're a skeptic, you'll say, no, it's probably not, because history has taught us every year, people predict finally that we're going to be at peak coal and the use of thermal coal is going to finally tip over. And that's what the current policy scenario red line at the bottom says. However, if you believe any of those things on the right, then actually it won't. And if history is our guide, the use of thermal coal will grow again this year. And I'll tell you, the thing that keeps being talked about, which watch out, is AI and coal-driven AI, especially in China. So we'll see. But if AI keeps growing at the rate it's growing, there's no other way to power it other than with gas, nukes, or the cheapest alternative right now, coal. And here's the last, this is the last slide on coal. This is another way of looking at use of coal historically up to 2024. The blue at the bottom is Asia Pacific. So there's India and China together essentially, and what is happening. And what it actually really illustrates is the rest of the world is either holding its own or weaning itself, especially North America is weaning itself off coal. But I mean, relatively speaking, that's what's going on in the world. So sure, it's better, but there's a lot more to do. So why are they persistent? Oh, sorry. The point I was going to make on this slide, is that the two places where I think we can target and where Canada can make a difference is in coal to gas switching, which I think RJ is going to talk about, and gas on gas competition. I think Canada has a really, really, really good opportunity to be a lower carbon intensity provider of natural gas in the world. So that's that gas on gas competition. And as long as we don't break the bank on price, the ability to incentivize countries that care about climate. And there are countries in that coal supply that genuinely would like to wean themselves off of coal, but they can't afford it. And that's a lot of those developing countries. And as long as the price of LNG stays at a place where LNG developers can make a margin and it doesn't price you out of coal to gas switching, that left-hand place is a real opportunity. Couple more slides. Nuclear we talked about. The one thing I wanted to talk about nuclear is if you look at the annual capacity additions on the right, 1990s, 2000s was a terrible time. And in my opinion, this is where the environmental community really let us all down, because there was a crusade against nuclear power, which I think was incredibly misplaced. And I think nuclear power is a huge opportunity. The more nukes there is out there, the less you need gas, the less you need coal, the less you need LNG, the less you need like all of it. So I am a huge proponent of nuclear. I think that had it not been for opposition to nuclear, you'd have seen a lot more capacity coming on. The problem the globe has with its nuclear fleet right now is it's getting old. And so you're seeing retirements. The good news is, if you look out to the 2030s and 40s, there's a lot of belief that you're going to see a resurgence of nuclear for all the reasons we talked about, and I don't need to revisit. We just had a great panel on that. And then I think this is about almost my last slide. The other thing I think a lot about when I think about this issue is it's astounding to me the hubris of the West when we talk about how electrification is the future. Everything's going to be electrified all the time. All we got to do is figure that out. The fact is, there's a big chunk of the world. So go back to 2010, 3 billion people. We've got it all the way down to 2 billion people that don't have access to energy, to clean energy. And if anybody has ever traveled in sub-Saharan Africa and seen what goes on with charcoal and briquettes and what people do with biomass to try to just survive, look at that bottom green bar. Even though the number of people without access to fuel is going down globally, Africa continues to climb. Like there's more people without access to clean fuel in Africa today than there was in 2010, and it's because of population growth. And if you look at the right-hand picture, that's the fuel that they're using and that they're seeking is fossil fuels. It's not, nobody's building a big grid in sub-Saharan Africa. So eventually maybe, but for today, fossil fuels have a really important role to play. This is the point earlier about the way the pendulum's swinging. It took me 2 seconds on Google. I could have put up 50 more headlines like this. This is so sure, the COP happened. It was great. It's that community talking, to themselves about all these important things. Here's why that context point matters about that I put up at the beginning, because the ability for governments to do things in the climate space, like EV rebate programs, for example, depends on their ability to pay for them. And citizens' tolerance and interest in that really depends on their hierarchy of needs. And I saw this all the time. When I worked in government, we did all kinds of polling all the time on all this stuff. And as long as people are feeling good, like they have jobs, they feel good about the healthcare system, they feel good about the economy and all of that, then they really do want governments to invest in climate. When those things aren't true, climate drops down. Go look at the polls. You don't have to believe me. Climate's ratcheting down globally because of all those context things that I keep talking about. So then the real question is, how do people who care manage to keep the ball rolling forward when things like this are going on? And this is my last slide. So the reason I support FNCI and I like it is I actually do care about all this stuff. I like FNCI because it's First Nations led. It's not industry led. It's not government led. It's First Nations kind of coming together and figuring out for themselves why they should support LNG or a power line or whatever it might be. We saw it today. They're bringing in people who know their facts, science-based, but it doesn't ever feel like it's a trade-off between those core Indigenous values of the environment and 7 generations and all that. And that's the last reason I really support this process and this group is I believe more and more the last point is the most important point. Nobody's building anything big or important in this country anymore unless First Nations and Indigenous people generally are a big part of it. And it doesn't matter if it's any of those things, power lines, pipelines, LNG, whatever it might be, that if First Nations, so that correlation between FNCI, support for those things and things actually getting built, I think is absolute. So that's it. Thanks. And I am happy to answer questions, but I don't know if you want to do that now or because I don't want to take up RJ's time either, but I am happy to take questions if you want.
Okay. Use the mic. So in Linda's presentation this morning, she presented, it looked like a graph or a chart to me that said 2015, they were looking at a 4 or 5% increase, and now it's down to 2. So it looked like there was improvement. So did I misinterpret that?
Sorry, improvement in what? So CO2, global CO2 emissions?
Temperature increase, yeah.
I was talking about CO2 emissions, but
okay, but so I assume they're related though.
Yeah, probably. I assume they are too. Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm just.
Hang on, Linda's gonna jump in.
Okay.
Mike? There you go.
I think that's a good question, and we should look at how to reconcile that. I was quoting degrees relative to the trajectory of global warming, and Dave is quoting CO2 emissions. But we're both quoting, I think, Dave, the current policies report of the new IEA outlook.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's where that chart's from.
Yeah, so mine was about a trajectory, and Dave's is about an absolute quantitative number, right? But both of them are derived from that report. But that's a good question. We should look into it afterwards. Yeah. Dave, I wanted to ask you, I missed, you were your slide where you talked about Canadian strategic advantage, gas on gas. I got that one. But what was the other one?
So there's fuel switching. So, and I think RJ is going to talk about this, but here's the tricky part of being in the LNG business globally. When you are a customer and you're looking at buying LNG, sometimes or most times right now, I would say you're buying it to set up one of those, a power plant, right? And they're very flexible power plants, and you can turn them on and off much more easily than a lot of types of power plants. And so that's where you're seeing a lot of the growth. Where I think there's a bigger market, and Canada should be really promoting it more aggressively. And it's part of this study that RJ is going to talk about, is putting coal plants out of business by switching them to gas. And a lot of environmentalists will fight against that because they'll say, oh, no, you shouldn't do that because it's still a fossil fuel. I say better gas than coal. And what's happening, I just showed you the China stats. Like, why are they building so much coal? It's because it's cheaper. And so this is the tricky part of LNG, because the switching depends on what's the price of thermal coal today, what's the price of LNG today, what's it cost to build those plants, deliver the fuel, all of that. But typically the price historically has fluctuated somewhere between $6 and say $9 for a million BTUs of LNG delivered. Right now, that's actually the global price of LNG, depending upon which price index you look at, is, call it $9 or $10. That's pretty close to in the money, right, to displace one of those coal plants. So now if you're China, and I'm going to say, what would it take if I was the guy in China trying to firm up my power system to design and build an LNG gas facility versus a coal? First, they're going to look at cost every time. I've been in markets, so I've been in these meetings 100 times all over Asia. It's always about cost first. But if you can get into the money, then their next question is going to be, can I trust the security of supply? Do I believe it's going to show up? Because coal, I just showed you the infrastructure they're building to deliver coal. That's in their own backyard. They'll decide whether to permit the coal miner. It's all in their control. Buying LNG is first cost, second security of supply. So here's a very interesting international global context point for Canada. Are we going to be friends with China? Should we get into strategic bed with them? Should we form these kind of partnerships and become a reliable supplier of cost-effective LNG to China? Well, that's a geopolitical question, right? But I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that if we don't, and I do think China cares about emissions. I do think they do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be building so much renewables. But they also are going to firm that system up, and it's going to be, they're building nukes. We heard they're in the nuclear game. But it's mostly coal. And I think coal to gas switching is a big opportunity.
So just to follow up on that note.
It's not on.
Just to follow up on that note, is there even enough natural gas to replace coal?
No, I don't. No. This is why it's a sophisticated question, right? And this is why I wish, and I used to always say when I was the Deputy Minister of LNG Development in BC, the environmentalist community and that industry should be best friends, because so is gas better than coal? Yes. Are renewables better than gas? Yes. Are nukes, part of this? Yes. So if we could have an all of the above conversation, you could minimize the number of gas plants you have to build, which we should be doing. Like, we should be trying to get the world off fossil fuels as fast as we can, as quick as we can, for all the right climate reasons. But we seem unable to have a better, best, good, better, best story. And we end up in these polar opposite positions where, well, it has to be this or it can't be that, as opposed to saying, why can't we embrace, gas where it makes sense and, build that infrastructure? Because there is not enough gas or LNG to displace all that coal we're talking about. So all we're talking about is trying to be strategic and make a difference where we can.
One more question, right?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Dave, I got another question for you here. So the Alberta tier carbon market was kind of instrumental in helping Alberta come off of coal.
Yeah.
And a lot of those plants were reconfigured to gas.
Yeah.
Not a specific question, just more would love to hear your thoughts on China's national emissions trading system and how that might fit into the fold here and lessons learned for Canada.
Yeah. I don't know much about the Chinese part of that question. I 100% agree with you on tier. It's what made that switching equation work, right? Like, it's such a great example of what I said earlier of companies and consumers became ambivalent because it didn't cost me anything. And that's where tier made that work. What I think is a way to, what I can speak into is what Canada should have is a tier-like system nationwide. Because I'll tell you the other thing, and we haven't talked about it today, I don't know if it's on the agenda for tomorrow, but this idea called nature-based solutions and how First Nations could play into nature-based solutions, that's a killer way to keep that price of LNG in a place where, you know, you can create all these green attributes around it, have a win-win from a First Nation standpoint, because they also get to be providers of nature-based solutions. And again, not every country cares about climate equally, but there's some out there that really do. And if we as Canada could say, look, price-wise, we can make it the same. Let us work with you on, you know, we'll bring innovative financing structures to help you build that gas plant. We'll be a reliable supplier at a cost you can afford. You don't have to build that coal plant. And we use offsets and you know, carbon pricing programs to make all that work. That's exactly what we should be doing, in my opinion. Yeah.
Can you make this work?
All right, I need to stop. Sorry.
Okay. No, I want to just
Can we get that presentation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We're taking advantage of AI and recording everything, and then we're going to make a summary, and we'll make sure the summary is accurate. From the speaker's perspective. I don't think I have to say very much about how all that set up RJ. That was great. Thank you very much, Dave. Yeah. And I think most people know RJ, and if you don't, you should. Just like you should all know each other in this room, because there's a lot of great minds here, and RJ's definitely one of them. So thanks very much for making yourself available and for working with us and putting up with us. Thanks so much. Off you go.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you for putting up with me. So I am at the University of Calgary now after 27 years living in the U.S., Eurasia Group in Colombia, but happy to be back home. And so far, so good. Lots of exciting things happening on the side of the border, which is great. And I appreciate FNCI and the fact that, as we heard from Linda this morning, it's really looking at the sort of local, national, and global perspectives, because you really have to have that understanding of how they all affect each other, which I thought the conversation today has been a good example of that. I'll probably focus a little bit more on the global side, pick up on Dave's comments, and hopefully that'll be a good end to the day here as we go. So we did a big study on Asian decarbonization almost 3 years ago now with FNCI when I was at Columbia. And the focus was on the role of Canadian gas, hydrogen, and ammonia as potential kind of catalysts for decarbonization in Asia, both, as Dave said, through gas-on-gas competition and through coal-to-gas switching. We certainly acknowledge now that there's a full competition, which we've heard about today. There's hydro, there's nuclear, there's renewables, there's efficiency, there's carbon capture, all playing a role as well. And what we want to do the next phase, which I'll talk about here, is look at this in a little bit more of a deep dive into a particular market, in this case, Korea, where we think that there are some interesting dynamics at play in terms of their just announced plans to phase out all coal by 2040, which I'll talk about. But before I do that, let me talk a little bit about the LNG market more broadly. What are these key themes that we've been tracking? What kind of world are we entering into here as we look at new LNG projects that have already come online in BC, like LNG Canada, or may soon come online in the next few years? There's certainly a lot to say on the coal switching side, not just in the electric power sector, but in sectors like shipping and heavy trucking as well, where we're seeing LNG grab market share in those sectors. There's the industrial side, where there's talk about the chemical sector and steel sector. And then the big ones, I think, that are probably the biggest drivers of electricity demand and potentially gas demand. We've heard a lot about AI and data centers, but we haven't talked about cooling demand, which actually, as you'll see a little bit later, is perhaps the most important story here, particularly for energy demand in Asia. So what's happening on the supply side? I mean, the short version is we're entering a gas glut, which may sound bad, in terms of short-term prices and who wants to sell into an oversupplied market. But there's another side of it which we can talk about as well. There's a lot of U.S. gas that's come into the market as LNG. There's a lot of Qatari gas, probably the lowest cost, lowest carbon LNG supplier from the Persian Gulf. Some is going to Europe, some is going to Asia Pacific. There's also still the question of the Russian gas. Europe isn't buying it anymore, or they're about to phase it out by 2028. So more is going to end up in China, mostly by pipeline, but some by LNG as well, and also perhaps in places like India. Now, I think the most interesting question here really is, what's the relationship between this big supply glut and prices? And as Dave suggested, what will those lower prices for gas mean in terms of market uptake and competition with coal? This is quite important here in British Columbia. There's been a lot of studies from different environmental organizations saying that LNG in British Columbia is too risky, right? That maybe there's too much supply from other sources. It's going to cost us more to make it than we can sell it for. And there's cheaper alternatives with renewable. Those are all fair questions. And I assure you that the companies developing the LNG projects look at them very closely, as do the buyers. I wanted to offer a different perspective, not from me personally, but from the International Energy Agency. And this is looking at the idea that from a free market point of view, we actually might see more demand response from low prices, and that the effect of a gas glut and more supply availability from the US and Qatar and now Canada actually will make the buyers in Asia feel more comfortable with the market, that there's more sources of supply out there, you're not dependent on a single location, and prices are trending down. Now, prices have to be low enough that the developers can still make a rate of return, right? You get to a certain point, the price is too low, nobody can invest in an LNG project here or in the US or elsewhere. What the International Energy Agency has said in the most recent outlook is that they think the market's headed towards a marginal price similar to what the US LNG costs are, which is around $8 or $8.50. And at that price range, and remember, we had prices that were $50 MMBTU during the Ukraine war, and that scared away a lot of potential buyers. But at that lower price range, similar to the US, you could see 65 billion cubic meters of additional demand from price elastic sectors like industrials, like transportation, like power plants. So they actually see some upside from these lower prices. Now, for perspective, 65 billion cubic meters is about half of the US current production, about 50 million tons. So that's a pretty big increase from these lower prices. And that will have a huge impact on the competition between coal and natural gas in Asia. Okay, so let's see here. A few thoughts on where that demand is coming from. We talked a lot about coal. Dave went through some of this already. We're seeing a lot more coal plants being built than gas-fired power plants, at least in terms of Asia. And large part of that is because gas has been too expensive, especially for power generation. Again, the question is, will lower LNG prices make a difference there? We also talked a lot about data centers. And what's interesting here, looking at this particular IEA data, is that at least in one of the IEA scenarios, they're talking about a potential peak in the use of fossil fuels for data centers sort of magically happening around 2030. And I'm not sure what's going to change between now and 2030 in terms of alternatives to fossil fuels to power data centers. Absolutely, we're going to see nuclear. Absolutely, we're going to see renewables and hydro, et cetera. But there's so much data center demand growth, it's likely to require all of the above. And I'm not sure that it's a bit of a risky bet to assume that gas and coal will not be needed to support this data center growth by 2030. I would take the other side of that bet personally. It's not just me thinking that. I think it's also true in the US. If you pay attention to all the things coming from President Trump, one of the interesting topics from him is his talk about an energy emergency in the US. It's interesting. You hear him talk about energy dominance on the one hand, but also an energy emergency. And that's basically the idea that there's so much data center demand growth in the US that electricity prices are rising and becoming more of an inflationary factor. And, the US is, particularly on a region by region basis, struggling to keep up with that electricity demand. So what that means is Trump is trying to fast track as much electricity production as possible, and that will be supported by gas, and yes, even coal in the U.S. Right? Trump has actually delayed some of the proposed closures and cancellations of U.S. coal plants. Not sure we're going to see any new ones built in the U.S., but they are keeping some of the existing ones going. And most importantly, building what Dave said, applies in China also here, is it's not just the new plants being built, it's how the existing ones are being used. Are they running at 20% capacity, 50%, 80%? Because this data center story and the need for firm electricity, those coal plants are starting to run at higher levels, which means more coal consumption, more greenhouse gas emissions, which is an important trend here as well. By the way, for Canada, there's a big question here. Should we export gas and electricity to the US for their data centers, or China, or do more here at home? And that's something I think is quite interesting as well. I mentioned the cooling demand, and this data from the IEA shows that as big as the data center electricity demand is, which is the red bar here, the demand for space cooling and appliances is actually still bigger. And I think that's really important to point that out, because all we hear is data centers, data centers, data centers, data centers over and over and over again, even in Alberta. But the fact is, we're talking about the billions of people in emerging Asia. Their priority is not data and video games and autonomous vehicles. Their priority is survival. And I'm not saying in a light or trivial way at all. I'm saying, the rising temperatures there and the lack of access to cooling are a real public health issue in India, in Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, you name it, and even parts of Africa as well. So the solution to that is air conditioning. Air conditioning is electricity. It'll be from coal in some places, from renewables in other places, from gas in other places as well. But the point is, it's a key driver of demand. In Southeast Asia in particular, we're talking about 4% annual electricity demand growth. Go back to our conversation this morning about the BC plan, right, and how much difficulty we're going to have here keeping up with that. Imagine 4% demand growth, right? You're going to be doubling the grid quite quickly here. And the biggest driver of that is more frequent heat waves and increased electricity consumption for air conditioning. And there's even other sectors like shipping and so forth that I won't have time to get into here as well. But the point is, these are all the factors where gas, including Canadian LNG, will be competing for market share to support all this demand growth. Now, what we wanted to do in this study, and I'll just explain it briefly here before we go to the Q&A, is we wanted to say, okay, these are all the macro factors. How is this playing out at a particular country level, and almost at the sort of regional company and plant level? Because I think that's quite instructive in terms of where the rubber hits the road here. So this is a follow-on to our last study, and we've got some funding from Natural Resources Canada to do this. We're partnering with one of the Korean universities to do a deep dive in how these macro dynamics are going to affect coal to gas switching in South Korea specifically. Why South Korea? Well, if you look at South Korea's energy mix, oil for transportation and industrials is the largest source of energy consumption. After that, coal, primary for electricity, is the second largest. And really since around 2005 until about 2021, coal demand was actually growing in South Korea. Interesting, we're talking about an advanced industrial economy here, but one that has no real domestic oil, gas, or coal reserves, has limited land availability for large-scale solar and wind projects, and has no hydropower. They do have nuclear power, but that's been controversial depending on which government is in power at the day. So coal has played a big role in South Korea. That's been a particularly large role in the electricity sector, where coal has actually been the largest source of fuel for electricity production. And you can see that after that, we've had natural gas has been gaining share. Nuclear has been up and down a little bit. But solar and wind are actually almost nowhere to be found in South Korea. Now, that's not to say that won't change in the future, and they're not looking at expanding renewables, but unlike China that has sort of unlimited money and unlimited land and a vast transmission grid, South Korea doesn't necessarily have that advantage. And from an emissions perspective, when you look at all of the greenhouse gas emissions in South Korea, about almost 50% are tied specifically to coal-fired electricity. Oil and natural gas play a significant role here as well. Now, in sort of a coincidence of timing, just as we were doing the study, the Korean government announced in Brazil at the COP 30 that South Korea would phase out its existing coal production or consumption in the electricity sector by 2040. That was seen as quite a significant headline. However, as is often the case, the devil's in the details here. Good timing for our study because there's a lot of questions still to be determined. First of all, the government announced they were going to phase out coal, but the actual plan of how they were going to do it would come sometime next year. So, okay, that's an important question. And then if you read the fine print even more, they said of the 60 coal-fired power plants in South Korea, they're only committing at this point to retiring 40 of them. Okay, that's good progress, but what about the other 20? Well, it basically suggests that you need a certain number of base load plants to maintain reliability as you bring more wind and solar and other things onto the grid. And also for just reliability purposes, if you shut down some of those coal plants, you need to make sure that you have something to maintain frequency and latency on the grid. They're also going to look at carbon capture for their existing coal plants. They may blend ammonia, but they're actually looking at pretty significant increases in their overall greenhouse gas reduction levels by 2035, particularly for the electricity sector. So to go full circle here, the question we want to look at in our study is how are they actually going to do this? And can Canadian LNG and clean fuels be part of that solution? So the questions that we're looking at in our study here, I won't go through them all now. It's interesting, the question about the Chinese emissions pricing, because Korea actually does have a European-style cap-and-trade system, which will be a factor in this. There's also an energy security aspect, right? The Koreans are very dependent on gas imports from the Middle East and from Russia right now. There'll be a question about methane intensity and the gas-on-gas competition. Will Canadian and BC LNG have an extra advantage because of the lower methane intensity of our shipments? And then I think importantly, talking about geopolitics, where does Canadian gas fit into our larger economic and political relationship with South Korea? Right, we know that Prime Minister Carney is trying to diversify from the U.S. There's a lot of support for that. We talked about maybe buying submarines from South Korea and expanding trade with them. Well, LNG is going to be an important part of that here as well. So where does coal displacement fit into that broader trade and geopolitical relationship? Now, some of these study questions have been looked at before, but what we're trying to do differently here is look at this at the plant level. And you look at those plants, and this is a map of the coal plants in South Korea. We'll be over there in February interviewing officials from these utilities, the regulators, government, energy ministry, climate ministry, to get a sense of the market and non-market factors that shape their decisions on coal versus gas versus nuclear versus renewables, and hopefully draw some lessons and conclusions about where Canada can create some commercial partnerships for our own LNG that will lead to coal displacement along with other sources such as renewables and nuclear. So in terms of deliverables, there will be a report. We're going to do some workshops in the run-up, but ultimately our goal is to present this research to NRCan probably in March, and then hopefully to the producer-consumer LNG dialogue in Tokyo in June as well. And we'll be looking for some extra funding for those events here, hopefully as well. So with that, covered a lot of ground, but I know it's been a long day, but wanted to share with you our latest plans for our next research project. And welcome feedback, and look forward to working with all of you on it.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Questions? Linda's first. Then you. Go ahead.
Okay, so, maybe we need some wine for you to answer this question, but can you help us unpack the complexity around carbon accounting that will flow, and that's part of your question, Dan, from LNG displacement of coal, because that also goes into the public debate and gets all wound up in this whole supply question and future demand. Now, anyhow, can you do it in 30 words or less?
Yes.
All right.
The short answer is our Prime Minister doesn't care.
Okay.
I mean, and I don't mean to be crass or flippant. I just think I haven't heard him mention a word about carbon accounting since he was elected. And I I don't think, what I have heard him say in Asia is that Canada's potential to deliver 100 million tons of LNG for energy security purposes, for economic development for Canada, for Indigenous reconciliation, and potentially for coal to gas switching as well. That's a huge change from the previous government, where all they talked about was carbon accounting. Now, that's not to suggest that behind the scenes there isn't some thinking going on how are we going to reconcile all this with the clean energy plan in BC, but also with our federal NDC. But I would just say that the amount of emphasis on that is really scaled back quite a bit, probably more in line with where other countries around the world are. Maybe not the Europeans, but more the Japanese, the Koreans, and certainly not where the US, the Chinese, the Indians, the Russians are, who don't care at all. So I think we sort of dialed it back and maybe see that as more of a medium to long-term issue. I'm not saying that's good or bad. That's just my observation of what's happening.
Well, just a hot pursuit question here. I'm sorry I can't be here tomorrow. I'd love to hear the discussion on where nature-based solutions could start to come into an LNG equation. I know that's a hot topic in British Columbia, but if we're going to be looking at that kind of carbon accounting domestically, then it's got to show up, doesn't it, at the global level too?
We're still going to have provincial and corporate level GHG reduction goals that need to have carbon accounting and are, as I said, our own national plan. And I think what I'm seeing is there's going to be more flexibility to include things like nature-based solutions and offsets. And it won't be sort of a strict Article 6 framework as was maybe discussed, where it's like a one-for-one, formal. I think there's going to be a lot more mechanisms to get to there. But that's why it's so important to actually measure where the LNG is going, whether it's having a real impact. Some people are saying, it's actually just adding to keeping up with electricity demand growth versus displacing coal. But I think if you start to look at the plant level, you can see a little bit more of what's going on.
Do you mind? Are you going to change the topic?
No, I was going to continue with the topic, actually.
Okay, with what Linda said.
Yeah.
Okay, I got something to pile on there. Go ahead.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. A bit more of a boots on the ground perspective from my end. I trade and market and sell credits across most of Canada's systems. So one thing out of just the Alberta context, we loosely touched on it, was the displacement of coal to natural gas through the reconfiguration of plants. So that went from about 0.9 to 1 tons per megawatt hour down to about 0.5. So it's about half the emissions. So on the Korean context, right, you'd half the coal emissions roughly through those plant retrofits, and that's just through a viable carbon market. Now, to your question about accounting, right? One thing that we've just been seeing over the last, I'd say, quarter is demand pull from the Middle East as they start to create their own domestic systems to ready themselves for CBAM. As Qatar goes to export to Europe, they're now starting to say, okay, we have to actually create equivalent systems. So that is kind of in advance of any kind of Article 6.4 conversations, right? But it's just an interesting development we've seen, again, just from the trade floor.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I was going to mention the CBAM in the context of the question about China as well. I think CBAM is also sort of being weakened and diluted, but it still exists.
Do you just unpack what that is, CBAM?
Well, this is the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which basically puts a price of carbon on imported goods in certain sectors like steel, chemicals, aluminum, to account for the GHG emissions from the importing country like China or India. Yeah, exactly. It's sort of to protect sort of greener steel production and cement production in Europe. It's also got sort of protectionist flavor to it, which the Chinese and Indians don't like. Biden administration was all for it. Trump is completely against it. So that sort of creates some ambiguity. But to your point, I think even those who don't love it, like the Chinese and Qataris, have to sort of hedge on the idea that, maybe there'll be a Democrat president again in the U.S., or maybe the Europeans will, double down again, and the politics will shift there as well, because these are all 30, 40-year assets at minimum. So that is the kind of thing that will shape thinking in Korea as well, right? That if the Koreans want to send steel and cement, well, not cement probably, but steel and chemicals to Europe, they could be affected by the CBAM, and would they want cleaner fuels like Canadian gas or renewables or nuclear in there as well? So that's part of the long-term picture, for sure.
I got a related question as well. For the people that were actually at COP, I'm curious, was Article 6 talked about? Is it still a thing? Like, because you used to hear a lot about it in the reporting. Like, what was your experience?
I didn't hear anything about it, but I wasn't necessarily in places where they were discussing it.
I wasn't there. I was just listening to podcasts and reading the posts, but I don't think it came up very much, Dave. Yeah.
In parts, it
And
now exists.
It used
Yeah.
to a lot. You're right. It
Yeah.
used to be a big deal, but I think the complexities around it have almost sunk it. I don't know.
One of the things I learned from your presentation today is that we generate most of the generation of our electricity goes, we burn coal to generate electricity, releasing CO2, which heats the planet, which we use to cool ourselves.
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah, I just love humans.
Right.
Okay. So,
Well, and by the way, I mean it's an interesting question. There's an environmental justice question in there somewhere.
so I just want to come back to this point about carbon accounting, and notwithstanding the fact that the Prime Minister doesn't care, and the last Prime Minister, that's all they cared about, and we haven't been getting blown by the winds of political change. Sometimes we're kind of mainstream, and sometimes we're totally not, but we carry on, and it's important to know. Which was always part of this, and I'm just checking in with you on this and making a point. It's important to know what the carbon implications are of using our LNG to do things like displace coal in Korea. That's important information, and related to that is one of the shocking things that was said in this room in a previous collaboration forum by executive responsible for Clean BC. And it was shocking because it was obviously not from the standard playbook. And the suggestion was speculation and thinking about, well, what is it that BC or Canada could do that would make it easier for a transaction to occur between a Korean company that wants to get off coal and use Canadian LNG and a Canadian LNG producer to sell them the LNG. And the suggestion was, do the accounting and give them a discount, take it off their carbon tax bill. In other words, if you lead to a legitimate reduction in emissions, and it happens to be in Korea, it's still happening in the climate. And as long as we don't double count it in Korea and Canada, the advantage could be in the price reduction because you reduce carbon tax liabilities, which enables the LNG to be sold at a more competitive rate. And you can create one of your carbon club ideas in one of the iterations. I'm sort of refreshing our memories about that conversation and wondering where it fits, recognizing NRCan is pretty specific about its appetites and what it wants out of this, and also recognizing there's LNG producers in the room here, and you can help. This study is not limited to what NRCan wants, and so we can expand the scope. And the problem we identified back then, and it probably still exists, is the transaction between the producer and the consumer is through a middleman, so to speak, a broker, and you can't necessarily track the molecules, and so that we don't know whether or not it's this particular cargo load of LNG that's going to POSCO Steel or whatever it is in Korea that's going to utilize it. But I'm just wondering, is there a way that we can still weave that into the research?
Yeah, look, I was giving an intentionally provocative answer to Linda's question, but I think the reality is carbon accounting was a gateway kind of regulatory factor for these LNG projects in a way that it's not at the moment. And I think the focus is now back on what it should be, which is actual mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. And that is sort of the end game versus, along with other objectives like trade and diversification of the US, versus making it all somehow balanced in a ledger. I think it went too far in that direction, and it's still important. NRCan's obviously still asking about it. But I think it's nothing's on hold while that's happening, right? So things are still moving forward. But to your point, these things can change, right? These politics go in cycles, and it could be once again a big issue at some point. And where I think it's quite specific, ironically, now is on the Korean side. When I look at the details of what the Koreans announced at COP, I didn't hear them talking a lot about gas. In part because, are they going to be able to announce on the one hand a 71% cut in their greenhouse gas emissions for electricity at the same time they're bringing in more gas? So, okay, we're losing GHGs by bringing in gas to replace coal, but we still have gas, right? To Dave's point earlier. So how that's where the count, I think, actually was really be most acute, ironically, on the Korean side, less on the BC side. I think the BC side, I think it's still important for our, as we heard this morning, the Clean Energy BC plan, for civil society, for the companies that have their own like net zero type commitments. My only point was that I think at the Ottawa level, it's not blocking the development of these projects the way it was before. But from many other angles, it's still going to be very important, including in our study.
Just further on that point, I think Minister Dix has made comments, and I won't quote him exactly here, but the essence of the point is that do we even really need to compare to LNG offsetting coal when we should really just be comparing to LNG on LNG? Because in BC, we have the lowest emission LNG projects, so why even go down that road in the conversation? And you get into that debate about the emissions around LNG and offsetting coal, and Linda's gone, but there used to be a lot of debate about that.
Well, yeah, for sure. And I think Canada has a lot of interest in developing a cooperation with the Europeans on the methane standard because, at least for BC, it'll benefit us. Whereas for certain parts of Canada and probably certain parts of the US, it won't be as beneficial. And those, even there, the abatement costs for lowering methane intensity are pretty low compared to something like carbon capture. So I'll be interested to see. This MOU announced a 5-year delay in the methane implementation, which I thought was interesting. But to your point, I think the LNG on LNG competition should benefit BC, and therefore we have nothing to lose, potentially something to gain from international regulations that support and create a premium for lower methane intensity, or at least if not a premium, more of like a closed market for. That said, the Europeans are trying to get rid of Russian gas right now, so methane may not be their current priority. But again, over the medium term, it's still going to be important to them.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit on this study because, it's Rob Celia. I'm an advisor to LNG Canada on greenhouse gas. And we are just about completing a study, a very similar study, and it is about end use of Canadian LNG in China, in South Korea, and in Japan. And when we often talk about this question, we often talk about it from our perspective. We're going to lower emissions by displacing coal, et cetera, et cetera. But our study is really geared to having them tell us, if you're buying our gas, what is it used for? What will it be used for? Will it displace coal? Will it displace something in steel making or thermal energy? So we have, we've asked the University of Petroleum in Beijing to study that in China, and the John Bach University in South Korea to study it in South Korea, and in the Energy Institute of Japan to study it in Japan. So those three entities are looking in their country, creating a report, and then saying, here's what your gas will be used for in country. And then we've asked Wood Mackenzie, who is basically an energy think tank, to look at that on the life cycle basis now and say, okay, if Canadian gas is being used for these purposes in those countries, tell us about life cycle. What is the actual net reduction? So those findings will come in the first quarter also, RJ, maybe about the end of first quarter next year. And but I think the driver for gas in those three countries, it starts with energy security. So those three countries, they're all buyers of LNG, big buyers. China's probably the only one with real growth. The others are sort of flat, but everybody is looking for diversification. They don't want a stock portfolio with only 4 stocks. They want a stock portfolio with more diversification. And if Canadian LNG is one with a stable political environment, a good pricing, and solid delivery of product, they want it in their portfolio. And so that's the real driver for all those three countries. China may be a little bit more so on the growth side. They are looking at peak coal. So when the chart that Dave showed where it hits that right at the top, I mean, they do care about climate change and they do care about reducing emissions. And they have a goal to peak at 2030 and then sharply decline. And so they're thinking about how do we do that? Well, LNG is part of that answer, as is nuclear and many other energy sources. So those are my comments. Just thought I'd throw that in. Thanks.
Yeah, and growth comes in different flavors, right? I mean, there's growth that comes from the Korean electricity demand may not grow as much, but it's the sort of composition of that demand, right, that's being met today. Less coal, more other stuff that creates a different kind of opportunity potentially.
I just have one more sort of observation. This is LNG on LNG complication with, better LNG, bad LNG. You got carbon accounting, which is like math, and there's so many different ways of doing it, and it's complicated. And you've got like geopolitics, you've got something displacing, LNG displacing coal. Carbon tax, wouldn't nuclear fix all of this? If we could just ramp it up 1,000%?
It's the if that's the problem with that. Yeah. Yes, if, but no, we can't. Now, in theory, if we heard a lot about SMRs, and some people say that there's a scenario where SMRs could displace both coal and gas at scale, but that's probably a 25-year time horizon, optimistically speaking. But, we've been wrong before on things like solar, so let's see what happens. But in the short term, the medium term, I don't think that's going to happen.
Because you'd think if they ramped up SMR, it'd become cheaper and cheaper to build those things.
Right, but it's a question of how long does it take for that model to actually work. Right, the first one's supposed to come online maybe in 7 years. So.
Oh, the issue is supply chain too. Mm-hmm. If you try to put all your eggs in one option, like right now, gas turbines, I'm told by Siemens, will be 6 to 7 years. Mm-hmm. A project we used to do on gas turbine when I was CEO 5-7 years ago was basically 500 megawatt, $500 million. The next one for New Brunswick will be over $1 billion, and the gas turbine will be a minimum of 6 years. So it could take longer, but if we do the same thing with SMRs, we're going to run out of enriched fuel, or we're going to run out of parts, or we're going to run out of, and that's the issue. But that's why one solution doesn't fit. But the question I wanted to bring about is the carbon, the accounting for carbon. The reason it was such a big issue in Canada, having sat 3 years on the net zero advisory body, is that people were really concerned about how we looked to the world. We have a high CO2 emission per capita, cold climate, big country. I probably burn a lot of CO2 to come here from New Brunswick, and I have to do it all the time because I live in a remote place. So we're not comparing apples with apples, but the risk of not counting would be that if you build 10 LNG plant and you raise emission, and Canada is committed to the world that we're going to drop by 20%, and it's all about how you count these emissions. And for me, I think we should come up with a solution that when it's for exporting in a competitive market, and that's what Dave, all presentation was about, whether it's gas on gas or gas on coal conversion. If we're competing in a competitive market with cleaner gas, we should not penalize our country's effort while we're helping others. And that has to be intuitive. But at the end of the day, for the purists, when you want to look at this, is that our emissions are going to go up by a large amount because we are producing more gas, even at 82% non-emitting producing power. So It's all the measurement we have set ourselves around the world. But to me, it's a very complex thing. It's like when Nova Scotia was telling us, we don't want your nuclear power in Nova Scotia because we have a ban on development of uranium. I said, well, I cannot distinguish the glowing electrons from the invisible other electrons produced by other sources of power.
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, I think Carney's given us a window to figure out this carbon accounting thing, right? Because eventually they're going to come out with a climate plan, and these questions will come up again. And he has his own political pressures. There'll be those in his caucus who want to kind of bring back some of the Trudeau era thinking on this, and that's probably fine. So we should do the work now. My point is just that the pressure is off. And again, I thought it was very striking for him to go to Asia and not mention climate, but instead talk about critical minerals and LNG and oil. Different tone.
It seems to me we could just come clean and say, look, we're doing our best. We didn't meet our targets. You don't have to be embarrassed about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that sort of pragmatism is where we are. But that's there's still lots of other reasons, including the Korean side, to bring in the carbon accounting, but it's not as a sort of a gateway towards developing the industry.
That's right. It just seems funny to do creative accounting to meet targets.
I'll leave that one alone, the accounting side. I'm sure there's some accountants in the room.
Okay. I would just, before we close, RJ, maybe you could just reiterate kind of the anticipated next steps, because some of the folks here and maybe some of the folks online would be interested in engaging in some of those steps in terms of workshops and that.
Well, we'll probably do a kickoff call in January, and then I'll probably reach out to many people here to get their inputs, including sort of plans for engagement with the Koreans. And as mentioned, we'll have probably a couple workshops as well as we sort of get interim findings and look for guidance from all of you. Mm-hmm.
And there's still the possibility of expanding the scope with a different kind of case.
Yeah, and Rob knows this too. And the data collection challenges in all these countries are different. And it's important to have local partners. I think the next study I'd like to do is looking more at Southeast Asia, because that's where a lot of the gas demand growth is going to be, where the coal switching is. The Indonesians, Vietnamese have coal phase-out targets as well. And gas will compete there with batteries and wind and solar and everything else. So that'll be another one, but the competitive dynamics are a little bit different for Canada, but there's definitely some interest there as well.
Right. Okay. Well, I think everybody has earned a free glass of wine or beer or a de-alcoholized drink if you would prefer that, and we happen to have all three. And you're more than welcome to partake. So let me just say a couple things about tomorrow and to wrap the day. Tomorrow we have a couple of interesting panels. One is about new technologies. We're all familiar with more or less a range of new technologies that are very promising. And we've been holding our breath or trying to hold our breath, waiting for them to become commercial scale, and it hasn't happened. And we're frustrated by that, and we're interested to know why. Like, are there things we could change that would enable those new technologies to play a bigger role in our own efforts in Canada to decarbonize? And a number of the nations that are leading FNCI are actually involved with those new technologies, have invested in them. We're also going to learn about one of them in particular, which is kind of brand new, and it's a combination of older ones. Biomass. It's a biomass gas hybrid that's connected to revitalizing the forest industry while also managing biomass, which is a major new theme in the nature-based solutions space, if I can use that term, an experience that a number of the speakers that are here on the nature-based solutions front want to tell us about, because they've been experiencing some really I guess it's now old news in California, but it's new news here. And so we look forward to hearing about that and this kind of blending of new technologies and nature-based solutions, and it's all sort of fitting together. So that's what we have in store tomorrow. I don't know whether if it's really true. It feels like it, but I don't know that it's true. That sometimes it takes someone to put a gun to your head for you to start to have a real conversation. And if we can, we've all been saying that thanks, Donald, for giving us a kick in the ass, but also the kind of conversation that we're having here today, we've had some in the past in FNCI, but they haven't been as straight up. And it's been a really great conversation. And I really appreciate all of the speakers and everybody else for just, trying on new things. And maybe you're talking about something maybe you don't like to talk about, but that's okay, because we got to figure it out. So thanks, everyone. And we'll see you tomorrow, I hope. And enjoy a glass of wine on us, or beer, or de-alcoholized drink, which is going to be right in the foyer here, hopefully right now. Thank you.